Good afternoon again. I'm Jasmine Xu, a faculty member here at Flame University, heading and promoting digital learning initiatives here. On behalf of the university, I'd like to welcome you all to join today's webinar. This Connection series webinar is here to help you discover the value of interdisciplinary thinking in the post-COVID-19 world. We hope that through these conversations, we can help you connect the dots, look beyond the obvious, inquire within, and have conversation with others when facing this uncertainty in life, either during or post this pandemic crisis. And like many institutions around the world, here at Flame, we have also just undergone a major transition from offline to online these past few months. And thankfully and successfully, we are proud that we have achieved what we did. And we have seen how quickly our staff and faculty members work together as a team to respond to this change. And none of our students' academic studies get delayed or behind. Now, during this exercise, we did see a lot of challenges ahead of us. But of course, many opportunities were also open in front of us for the first time. Among the Flame faculty members ourselves, we start to ask questions whether we did the best we could to help people transition from offline to online, and what kind of opportunities did we miss if online learning becomes the norm, and in what area should we be more mindful if we have to continue with this online model during this pandemic. Now, as the liberal education institution at Flame, we of course got a lot of internal debates and discussion going on. And another thing is in India, will online learning worsen the inequality of access to education is something that we also want to keep in mind. So luckily and fortunately, we have an amazing colleague among us, Professor Prateek Shah, who is committed and dedicated his research in education technology. And a few conversations we have had so far have got me thinking, or help us actually try to come up with ideas and plans to move forward. So today I'm excited to have you here with us to continue the conversation I have had with Professor Prateek Shah. And in this webinar, he will share his views and discuss the topic of reassembling education in the digital age, media, cognition, and institutions. And let me just give you a little background about Prateek Shah. So he is assistant professor here of computer science program. He completed his PhD from the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, in the field of innovation and management in education. He has completed postgraduate diploma in management from IIM Ahmedabad as well. His bachelor's and master's degree in computer engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology, Atlanta, USA. Now, his doctoral thesis explored the role or potential role of digital media in the classroom. And he continues his research by looking at how the new developments in digital media and artificial intelligence might fundamentally change and shape our cognitive and social structures. So with that in mind, personally, he's also interested in asking how human minds, social institutions, our planetary ecology, and our very self might become anew in the digital era. So he enjoys reading, playing sports, video games, learning the piano, and writing poetry. And as you can see, he is a very dynamic person himself, and also a researcher and scholar who is dedicated his time and his attention in this domain. So I want to welcome you all to today's webinar. And without further ado, I think I'm going to hand it over to Professor Prateek. And if you guys have any question, please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A comment. We envision today to be a very interactive and lively discussion on this topic. So over to you, Professor Prateek.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for that introduction. And I'm just going to get started straight away because I think we want to cover a lot of ground and leave room for questions as well. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you spending your time here, and I hope it's worth your while. This is a brief outline of my talk. So I'm going to start by talking about how education is expected to change radically with digital media. And we all kind of expect this, but I think sometimes, I mean, even before I did my thesis, even I didn't understand how radical this change is actually, could be actually. Then we are going to talk about, how the current education system is deeply rooted in text. And I want to spend some time on the textual medium because it's been around for 5,000 years, and we really need to understand the implications of this for our education system before we understand how digital media might change it. Then I'm going to spend some time talking about how our minds and media are closely related, very intimately related, in fact, because again, until we understand this, I don't think we will understand the full implications of digital media coming in. And then finally, I'm going to spend some time talking about, how this shows us some directions forward for thinking about digital media when it comes to education. So moving to, so let me start by talking about how rapidly digital, media has come into our lives. I mean, and just to give some perspective to this, it was thousands of years after writing was invented that the printing press actually came in and made text widely available. Until then, textbooks were not really a common resource. With digital media, this has happened within decades. The World Wide Web has made digital content available globally very quickly. And of course, we've all experienced the change, in our communication methods already. But what I want to emphasize in today's talk is that media is not just for communication. And this is sometimes, important. We forget this because, of course, we think about media as something with which we communicate. But let's just take one example of, an industry that has changed drastically, the financial world, finance, banking, commerce. Initially, when digital media came in, it was just a communication channel. So instead of going to your bank, you could maybe download a form from the website and, fill it up and maybe submit it online also after a while. But it was just an interface. Digital media just acted as an interface between us and the banks. Recently, though, we've seen how, the entire financial system has moved digital. It's become the operating system in some sense of the digital world, of the financial world. And, it's completely changed the way we interact with money, with each other, with the way we do commerce. So this is not just a communication change. I mean, it's a far deeper change in our fundamental institutions. And we'll keep coming back to this through the presentation. But see, when we talk about finance, and it's a fairly complex system, I mean, finance, banking, they're complex systems. But I really would like to say that they're nothing compared to education. The complexity of education as a system is immense, and this is why it's so slow to change, despite all these innovations coming in. Firstly, for example, I mean, the goals of education are deeply contested. I mean, if I take banking, we can, probably within an hour or so, we can come up with the 3-4 parameters that we want to optimize. We want efficiency, we want security. But with education, I mean, hundreds of years we've been debating, and we still are not decided on what exactly the goals of education should be. As far as the processes of education are concerned, it transforms the developing mind. And this is something we really don't understand. We want to transform it, but we don't really understand it. So the mind itself is complex enough. But when we're talking about the developing mind, the mind of a child who's growing, it's a complex system continuously changing. So, I mean, it's really very complex, and we don't, I mean, we understand it better today than we did 30 years ago, but we still don't really understand it. And finally, it passes on these intricate knowledge systems that are built on the textual medium. And because text was the only way for us to actually store and transmit knowledge for many, many, millennia, all our knowledge systems, contemporary knowledge systems are in some sense built on the textual medium. So, this very complex system is facing this very radical change. And we are all looking for, answers to what is digital learning going to be like. And I mean, I want to just say upfront here that to me, at this point in time, I mean, this early in the world phase of digital learning, it's a little bit like asking for the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And for those of you who haven't not read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I just want to give a little context because there's an important point I want to make here right at the beginning of this presentation. So it's, the book is a science fiction work, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and in it, there is a civilization on a distant galaxy which creates this supercomputer. And they ask the supercomputer, to compute the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And the computer says, okay, I will need 7.5 million years, so about 75 lakh years. And okay, so everyone waits and waits and waits, and generations and generations later, their super descendants, go back to this computer, and they eagerly await. The entire world is waiting for the answer, and the computer says the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42, and that's it. I mean, that's the answer. And then someone had the very bright idea of asking, but what is the question? And the reason I want to make this point is because really right now, I think we are at a phase where we need to ask the right questions with digital media in education. I mean, I know we all are very eager for answers, but really I hope this presentation is going to make us ask some deeper questions that is going to eventually lead us to the right answers. And one of the questions we don't want to ask, which I really think we should stop asking, is will digital media make learning better? Will it improve learning outcomes? Will it? And the reason I want to kind of, I mean, this was an argument given back by Seymour Papert in 1987, that he said this is like asking, can wood make good houses? And if you live in a cave and someone gives you a piece of wood, I mean, you're going to wonder what to do with it. I mean, how do I use this to help improve my home? I mean, maybe I fix it a little bit there, maybe it stops a little wind somewhere, but I mean, if we are ready to reimagine what a house looks like, what it means to live in a home, then, wood can make great houses. We know this. And, we can be very happy with it, but we really have to be ready to reimagine what it means to live in a house. And so my theme for today, I mean, the very broad question that I'm going to kind of, under which I'm going to raise all these questions is, how might education reassemble? And I use the word reassemble in a very particular manner, because we have to kind of think of education as this very large system with a lot of many tiny moving parts, okay? And it's this, when we think about digital media, it's not about just removing one part and replacing it with another. We really have to rethink how all these parts will come together around this entirely new medium. So how does it move from textual foundations? And like I said, we'll be spending some time on what these textual foundations are like, to digital roots, considering the deep relationship between media, cognition, and institutions. And this relationship, again, if we don't understand how deeply media is tied to our thinking, and cognition, for those of you who are new to the field, it's basically just a term for how the mind works. So if we don't understand how media is important to how the mind works, how our society works, how our institutions function, then it makes it difficult for us to understand what digital media might mean for the education system. Okay, so let me now start talking about how deeply the current education system is rooted in text. And I mean, we all know that the textbook is central to the classroom. It has been so throughout most of our lives. Even today, when digital media comes in, it's not like the textbook has gone out. It pretty much remains there, And you can actually trace the history of this all the way back. I mean, people have traced it all the way back to Sumerian tablet houses, where government clerks were actually taught to take tax records on clay tablets. And that is, in some sense, the first classroom or the first school. And so text has been central to the classroom all throughout history for all these thousands of years. But in today's classroom, what that means is that we expect our kids to look at these textual representations, right? I mean, equations, graphs, these are the representations we can have in text. They are largely static. They can't move around really, because on paper, things can't move around. And we hope that by looking at these textual representations, they can eventually build up an understanding of the dynamic concept, which is behind the textual representation. So if there's a chemical reaction, which is a dynamic thing, it happens over space and time, we have to look at that equation and the graph and all these things and try to figure out what that means, what that equation what might be actually happening in that reaction. Of course, teachers play a very important role here, and this is basically why the lecture is so fundamentally important to classrooms today. The teacher has to make the effort of animating these static representations so that they can become a little more dynamic, and so that they can help the learner reimagine what is hidden behind the representation. Okay, so this is the part where we talk about how the learning environment is going to change with digital media. I mean, that most of us are interested in this part, but I want to kind of slow down a little here first. And when I say learning assemblage here, you'll see that word on the screen. Please don't get disturbed by it. Assemblage, for those of you who are interested, comes from the work of the French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari. But I mean, it's not really important to know that. What you should understand is that I use the word assemblage because I want us to keep remembering that the education system is this vast network of interconnected bodies. And the grass in the background should remind you of that. I mean, if you look at grass, you can't pick up a blade of grass and say this is the grass. The grass is that entire network, which grows through its roots, wherever it wants, and kind of all over the place. And I want to talk about the education system as this vast network of which the learning environment is only one part. The classroom is only one part. And we need to also look at the other parts which are very closely linked to the classroom to understand how this change might work. So the first part I want to look at outside the learning environment is actually the conceptual systems that we have. So the classroom is about trying to pass on conceptual systems, but these conceptual systems actually come from a scholarly process or a scientific process where we try to capture these dynamic processes in static representation. So if you look at the work of science throughout these centuries, it's basically been about being able to come up with these text-based models, these equations, these graphs, to represent something dynamic out there in the world, whether it's the theory of gravity, whether it's an event in history. But it's only when we can put it down in text that it can actually become knowledge. So this is what I'm going to call the conceptual assemblage. So again, the same assemblage idea. It's a network of many moving parts. But this is what these static representations, where these static representations come into our classrooms from. The other part that is very important, of course, is the examinations. And however much we might curse them, however much we might criticize them, I'm not a big fan of them either. But they are what enable us to, today say that someone is learned or not learned. And because they also have to be text-based so that they can, circulate around to a central body, go to an examiner, and all those kinds of things, they tend to focus on also text-based learning. So they will mostly ask you algebraic, questions if it's a science exam or if it's a math exam. Very little focus on anything visual or things like that, because algebra is just very easy to represent in text. And so these algebraic examinations, which come from what I'm going to call the bureaucratic assemblage. So we have to remember that there's this huge bureaucracy around our learning systems, that makes it stable, that makes it, that gives it this, that allows us to formalize it in such a way. And our examinations actually come from there into the learning environment. So both of these are very important parts of the education system. And this entire, this entire network is what is completely rooted in textual media today. And that is something we have to be aware of. And the next part I want to talk about is the mind and media part. So again, coming back to the learning environment, where we are interacting with these static representations. What it's in our learning environments, basically it's the mind and media interaction. And I use interaction again very specifically because when we say interaction, we tend to think of two separate bodies, kind of interacting. But as we will see as I go ahead, the mind and media are actually so closely linked that it's very difficult for us to think about them as two separate bodies. They're actually almost one thing. So that's why I use the word interaction. And to me, this is central in the learning. I mean, this is how knowledge gets constructed, passed on, what do we want to do in our classrooms. And of course, there are many other important parts of the classroom, which I don't want us to lose sight of, because like I said, it's a network of many moving parts. But this is the part I'm going to focus on for now. This part is also slightly theoretical, so please bear with me for a few minutes and I'll try to keep it as interesting as possible. So I want to go through a few studies that show us how deeply the mind and media are related. The first one is by Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist. Some of you might have heard of him. He was very famous for his work in the psychology of learning. And he did this experiment with children who were just learning how to speak. And what he asked them to do was, for example, reach a jar of cookies that is kept at a height. And to do that, they have to use, let's say, a stool or a chair, which is maybe in the next room. So, it's not in their immediate field of vision or stimulus or whatever. So they, so what he found was that kids of that age, when they're just learning to talk, have to talk actually continuously to be able to solve this problem. So they will actually say stool and go to the stool at the same time. And of course, they won't just say stool. They will say, saying, oh, I need to get the stool or whatever it might be. But they have to keep talking. And if you stop them from talking, they actually can't solve this problem. And kids who have not learned how to talk cannot solve this problem at all, most of the time. With So language is very closely tied with their ability to solve this problem. Eventually, as they grow up, what happens is at a later age, the action and the speech actually separate a little bit. So they can actually say and talk about what they're going to do before they're going to do it. So now we can see an element of planning coming in. So they can actually say stool before they move to the stool. And as they go even older, what Vygotsky actually says is, they are still talking, but they're just talking to themselves, within themselves. So, and this is what he says is thought actually. Speech gets internalized into thought. And this is really important, because what this means is that the spoken language we speak is crucial for the development of what we consider our human intellect. So we think we have language because we are intelligent, but what Vygotsky is saying is we have intelligence because we have language. And this is very important. This is how important media is to our ability to think. If we go to writing now, Ong has this very nice book called Orality and Literacy. For those who are interested in this field, you should definitely read it. And he explores how writing alters us fundamentally as human beings. In fact, so much so that he says it's difficult for us as members of a literate society to imagine how a member of an oral society might think. And to just take a quick example of this, if I show you these 4 objects and ask you which is the odd one out, almost everyone will pick the log. You can have pick separate things, but most people have, will pick the log, and that's because the other 3 fall into this category of a tool, and the log doesn't fit into that. Okay. But if I ask a member of an oral society which the odd one out is in these 4, they will always say the hammer. And researchers have actually gone out and talked to people from oral societies and found this. And that's because the other 3 actually are always together in the woodshed or in the yard or wherever they are, chopping and sawing wood. And the hammer has no business there actually with the other 3. And and the researchers have tried to discuss with them why the log might, be the odd one out in a different way of thinking. And that idea is not meaningful to them. The idea of that abstract idea for tool is really not meaningful to them at all, which we consider so natural to ourselves. So one is, of course, so that means that, we are able to think of these abstract categories once we start writing. The second is, just as Vygotsky talked about, how we internalize speech, we also internalize the written alphabet. And this is very easy to see. If I say the word fun right now, I'm sure most of us are imagining, the letters FUN in our head. We think of the written word almost automatically, even without realizing it. And so we internalize the alphabet that we write. So the written alphabet interiorized, plus the abstract categories like tool, actually enabled us to create these formal knowledge structures like mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, science. And all of these came after writing was invented, with the Greeks mostly in the West. And, so our entire civilizational progress has actually depended on us, inventing writing. So how does it happen that something like media can change our minds so powerfully? And the cognitive science, which is the science of how the mind works, has actually come up with a few theories recently that helps us understand this better. And I'm just going to go through a few of these. Again, I'll try to be brief and interesting, but I promise we'll get into more practical things after this is over. So I want to go through 3 theories that are important in this regard. The first is what is called distributed cognition, and distributed cognition basically says that we should stop thinking about thinking as something that happens only within the individual human mind. So he takes the example of an aircraft cockpit, and he says, an aircraft cockpit can perform such a complex task like landing an aircraft. And it's an amazingly complex task if you think about it. There's this object falling through the air, and it is falling through the air at about hundreds of kilometers an hour, and we have to land it at this precise spot, and we do it again and again. And he says it's because the cockpit has this collective intelligence that is actually much greater than the sum of its parts. So not even the 2 pilots, the human beings in the cockpit are, it's not just their intelligence. It's actually them and the machines in the cockpit talking together through all these media that enables the cockpit to be so intelligent. And this is the idea of distributed cognition. And I'll come to the implications of this. The second one is called extended cognition. And it basically says that our minds actually extend themselves to include the tools we use as part of our body. So a simple experiment done on monkeys actually shows you can just measure, people actually measured how the neurons firing, and they actually showed that some neurons that fire only when light is put on the hand, on the right hand, for example, will actually also fire once the monkey uses a stick if light is shown on that stick. So the mind has actually extended itself to include the stick as part of the body. The third, and this is actually the most important, I think, in regards for what we want to talk about today, is embodied cognition. And again, I'll just take a single a single study which is important to explain this, which is the story of we all know about the abacus and how it was used by people to do complex arithmetic calculations very quickly by moving the beads up and down. And Stigler did this research in 1984 where he actually showed that people who are very, advanced in, who are experts at, using the abacus, actually don't even need to move the beads. They can just move their fingers in the same patterns in which they would move the beads, and they can do the calculations that way. And even more advanced users of the abacus actually stop moving their finger altogether. So they will just mentally actually do this entire process, and because of they have internalized the abacus in some sense, they can multiply 5-digit numbers, for example, in under 10 seconds. Now, if you and I mean, people who are used to the textbook way of doing things, we would actually write those 5-digit numbers out in our heads, in that long multiplication format that we've learned, and try to multiply the numbers. And hopefully, if we remember everything, we might be able to calculate the product of 2 5-digit numbers after a while. But abacus users can actually, advanced abacus users can actually do this pretty fast mentally because they've internalized the interactions with the abacus. And people have actually found the same thing with finger counting recently. In 2010, there was a paper which showed that the way we count on our fingers as children actually affects our arithmetic abilities even in adulthood, even though we are no longer counting on our fingers. So what this means is the way our body interacts with these tools, with this media, is extremely important to the way our intelligence and our thinking develops. And that's what I want you to take away from this, that media plays a huge role in our cognition, in the way we think, in our mental abilities, in our intelligence. Firstly, as distributed cognition shows, it enables humans and machines to think together in powerful networks. As extended cognition shows, it extends our mental capacities beyond our own physical bodies. And finally, it becomes our internalized thought. So it is the basis in some sense of our human intelligence, both spoken and written language, for example. What does this mean for learning? And now I'm going to actually get down to the back to the education part of it. So think about learning, for example, as initially, there's this learner and they are in this environment with lots of media, lots of people, lots of teachers, blackboard, notebooks, maybe digital devices. So they are in this distributed cognition network where the whole network together is actually solving certain difficult problems. So maybe the teacher solving the problem on the board, the students are copying. And so together they're learning how to solve these problems as a network. Over time, the students might actually develop a certain competence when using a certain, usually notebooks, in our classrooms. So using a certain tool or media, and then they can solve these problems on their own just with the notebook. And eventually, in some cases, they might actually internalize those interactions with the notebook so that they can actually do these without the notebook. And even when they go out of the classroom, they can actually apply this knowledge now to new areas, to new fields, because now it's become part of their cognitive capacity. And this is not a linear process, even though I've shown it that way. I mean, the moment our cognition changes, from here to here, our ability to enter distributed cognition networks changes. The moment we come here, our ability to collaborate with people changes. So it's basically a cyclical process, but right now we won't focus on that. Okay, so now that we've covered these parts, how deeply rooted we are in text, how deeply our minds are related with media, what does that imply for shifting digital learning? And so again, what I want us to remember is there's this huge, vast network rooted in textual media, and now we want to basically uproot it out of this and root it back in digital media. And so I mean, currently, most of the time, I think what we are doing with digital media, and of course there are exceptions to this, and lots of people are doing very innovative work. Most of the time, we are just doing this. We are just taking the static textual representations, putting them on digital devices, and calling it digital learning. In some cases, we started doing this. So we actually now recording lectures and putting them online, and but those lectures are still based on the textual representations. Okay, they have not changed the representations at all. They are just animating the textual representations, and we've put that on the digital device. And again, like I said, there are exceptions to this. People are doing very innovative work, but by and large, if you look at the uses of digital media for learning, this is what we are doing. And I want to kind of say that, look, after everything you've heard this far, I hope you get a sense that, in the long term, we really need to be visionary about this, because we could be headed into completely unknown worlds with digital media. I mean, think about, if you were an oral, before the invention of writing, you're a member of this oral society. Could you imagine how much writing would change us? How much it would change our schooling systems? I mean, our worlds, our civilizations. So when we are thinking about digital media and change, I mean, we really need to be aware that it's not that we totally understand where we are going with this. But, and this is really important, in the short term, we also need to be very grounded, because as I said, we are dealing with a very, very complex system. It's a system that touches the lives of almost every human being. It is deeply rooted in text. So it's not just a matter of a simple shift of, interfaces. Especially in India, we have limited resources to do this, and extreme inequality is already in our education system, which we really don't want to worsen. So we have to keep all of this in mind. And I think sometimes we are, kind of caught in between. We are neither visionary enough, nor are we grounded enough, and we just get excited and want to put some digital media somewhere. So we need to kind of be careful about that. At the same time, we need to be aware that there's a lot of new potential coming in for interacting with knowledge as digital media is coming in. And one of them that we're already using a lot is, of course, the fact that for the first time with digital media, we can capture audiovisual information and store it and transmit it to others. Before, with text, the only thing we could do is the only way to transmit information was if it was textual. But now we can do this with audiovisual information. But there are more exciting, potentials. We can now have dynamic representations of dynamic processes. So we're no longer restricted to static representation. Finally, our bodies can interact in whole new ways with digital media. For those of you who have interacted with the Microsoft Kinect or any of these gaming systems, I mean, you're aware of this. I mean, our whole new ways for our bodies to interact with. And this is one area where I think, research has only begun into how this could help transform learning. And there's a lot of exciting potential there. I go back to saying that, I don't have a very clear answer to digital learning. I mean, I'm not here to provide fixed answers, and I don't think there are universal answers to this. However, I mean, I don't want to leave you with nothing. So let me actually talk about some aspects from my own experience that I think could be useful going forward, some directions. Again, these are very limited. There could be, there could be whole new ways coming out of thinking about digital media and learning, but this is my experience, in my experience, some of the important directions forward. So one is we really need to embrace the smartphone as a learning device. And it's just an amazing device. I call it a magic wand because, you can actually wave it around and rotate it from side to side and it actually understands. It's literally like a wand. At the same time, the touch screens provide a lot of potential for interaction with our bodies again. And remember what we said about how important it is, the ways our bodies interact with tools and media, how important that is to the way our thinking develops. So we have whole new ways of interacting with this media. And of course, it's spreading rapidly across Indian households. I mean, of course, there's still a large digital divide, and we need to kind of keep that in mind. But at the same time, I mean, I've been to villages where almost every household had a smartphone, and there is a sense that this is something that could and it would be less. I think it would be much less exclusive than these computers and laptops that we're trying to kind of put in every school right now, and which we really don't have the resources to do. So we need to think about the smartphone very carefully as a learning device in our country. The other aspect that I want to talk about, which I found very interesting, is flipping the classroom. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept, I'll just give a quick overview. In our traditional lecture, the teacher lectures, the students mostly listen, they might ask a few questions. So that is why that's a dotted line. It's a weak interaction going back to the teacher. Again, weak interactions between the students. Then the student goes back home, they have to work with textbooks, notebooks, static models again. And they may or may not, if they have trouble, there's usually no one to help them out unless their parents are very good at the subject and they get some help from them. With the flipped classroom, what people are saying is, instead of this, let the student at home before the class watch a lecture that is sent to them. So a lecture is recorded, sent to them, they watch the lecture. And I mean, a lot of people say this is what flipping the classroom is about. And it's actually, I disagree. I mean, this is not the most exciting part. What is exciting is what this enables. And what this enables is that after watching the lecture, when the students come to the classroom, now teachers can do all sorts of interesting new activities with them based on the knowledge that they have gotten from the lecture. So I've actually worked with a school in Bombay which has implemented this a few of the teachers have done very interesting stuff in the classroom. And most of the reason they said we couldn't do this earlier is because our classroom time goes away in lecturing. And now that the lecture is being sent home, we actually have time in the classroom to do other things. So the only thing I think I would change, and I tried to change in my PhD thesis about this, is that this is still a one-way interaction between the media and the student, in that at the home they're just watching the lecture. We want to make this a two-way interaction. We really want to use the interactive potential of digital media in new ways, so that this is not just them watching something passively. And just to give you a quick example of some of the work I did in my PhD thesis, where we used both these ideas. We used a smartphone application, a touchscreen application, and we used the flipped classroom to actually help see if we can teach 8th grade geometry. Cube, cuboid, cylinder, volume, surface area in slightly different ways. So you can actually see this app. If you have a touchscreen device, you can just go to this link. You can check out the application. I won't spend too much time going through it here. It's a very simple application, really. It doesn't do much. You have these shapes on the screen. You can rotate them with your finger. You can fold them and unfold them. You can see the surface area and volume equations at the bottom, and you can play around with both the figure and the equation. And what is important that I want to point out here, there's one unique feature of digital media that's being used here, even though it appears very simple, which is not possible anywhere else, which is that you have the shape and the equation together, and they are both manipulable. So you can manipulate either of them, and the other one changes accordingly. You can't do this without digital media. You can have a box, made out of wood or something, and you can play around with it. You can fold it, unfold it, rotate it, but then the algebra is missing. And you can play around with the algebra in your textbook, but then you have no sense of how the shape that it represents is actually changing. So it's only with digital media that we can put both of these together. And again, remember how important the mind-media interaction is. Eventually, when we internalize these interactions, they change our thinking. So again, we need to think about how to interact with digital media in whole new ways. The problem I faced when I did this with a classroom in that school in Bombay I was talking about is that there were some changes. The students. So what we did was the students got these got this app at home. They used it on their parents' phones, and then they came to the classroom next day, and the teacher discussed it with them. So flipped classroom with interactive media, and there were some very interesting discussions that I found that were happening that were not happening otherwise in a different classroom. But eventually the teacher had to keep coming back to the idea that this is what you will write in the examination. And therefore, we come back to the textual roots. We come back to the algebraic problem solving. We keep coming back to the textual roots because we can't just change things in the learning assemblage. We have to remember that this is a complex network. And unless all the parts move together, we are going to have trouble implementing digital media in education with any kind of in any kind of radical, drastic way. I mean, it's going to be very, very small changes otherwise, not very effective. And these other, it's not like we have to go out and move these other parts. They are actually already moving. So if you think about the conceptual assemblage, for example, the way science is being done, whether it's through games where 13-year-olds are actually solving science puzzles that PhDs in biochemistry cannot, whether it's computer simulations, which are completely replacing the text-based equations and models, because you can now simulate very complex situations that you couldn't do with text-based equations, or whether it's the whole new revolution in machine learning, which some of you might be aware of. I mean, these neural networks that are doing amazing things, and they completely might change the way we do science, or any kind of knowledge building in the future. There's also a lot more potential to change other parts. So of course, the bureaucracy is very slow to change, and in some sense we want it to be, because the whole idea of it is to provide some stability. But at the same time, there are very interesting ways that this could change. So again, with neural networks, they are actually excellent classifiers. So you give them millions of cat and dog pictures, and you tell them which one is a cat picture and which is a dog picture, and then you give them a whole new picture, and they will actually just be able to tell you whether it's a cat picture or a dog picture. And of course, I mean, they can do this with much more than just pictures nowadays. They can do this with all sorts of data. And if you think about grading is nothing but a form of classification, right? I mean, you're basically looking at the assignment and saying, oh, this is an A category, this is a B category, or this is an 85, this is a 90. So there's a lot of scope here for actually moving out of our traditional grading ways into. But what is even more interesting actually is that neural networks are now not just good for classification. People have found ways of using this for generating new things. So generating music, generating plays, Shakespearean style plays. And going forward, we could actually start thinking about how to use this for generating personalized learning curriculum for learners, instead of just having a one-size-fits-all curriculum. So a very exciting potential, and like I said, unknown worlds. We don't know exactly where this is going, but I just wanted to give you a sense for where it might be going. And also the risk that we are running, because as things are changing so rapidly, there is a chance that this huge network, which is, we've been so comfortable with these last hundreds of years, might actually crack and split open, and there might be disconnects because one part might run ahead and the others might not follow. The conceptual assemblage might go somewhere, and our learning and bureaucratic parts of the education system might not actually carry. And so we might fail to prepare our students for, where they might need to be when they leave. And so to end, I think, like I said at the beginning, I think, we really need to think about how to rethink, redesign, reassemble education using digital media, not just replace the text with the digital content, but we also need to do this locally. So in very grounded ways, asking the right questions, but each of us needs to kind of, in our particular situation, think about what digital media might mean for us to improve learning where we are located. And of course, discussing with each other and learning from each other, but I think not looking necessarily for universal grand answers to what digital learning might look like. Okay, that is my talk, and I hope it was not too boring. Questions and comments are now welcome, and you can also email me your questions at at that email address. So thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you, Professor Prateek, for sharing with us your research and also walking us through this theoretical framework of how learning has evolved over time, right? And I do believe that there is a lot of discussion that can happen and continue. I think for today, we are here to open up the conversations with all of you. And also here at Flame, we also have assemble a team of digital learning, and one of the key participant or player of this digital initiative is Professor Maya Da, who is heading our Center of Teaching and Learning here at Flame. And she is also here with us to participate in this discussion, because we don't see this as an expert, like who can actually fix all the problems that we are facing today. We look at this as a participatory conversation that we can all bring out our ideas and start to exchange how we might move towards digital learning in the future. So I would like to maybe start with just a couple of questions that I personally have, and also I saw some of the audience seem to be interested as well. Professor Prateek has talked about flipped classrooms, and this is something that obviously, in certain areas, in certain institutions, they have started to practice flipped classrooms and even blended learnings. All these are terminologies that we have heard in terms of adapting technology in the classroom. And there are some researchers looking into how can this become more effective than the lecture style. And for people in my generation, right, none of us actually question about whether lecture is the effective style or not. And now we are actually moving into a direction where there are other possibilities when technologies are introduced in the classrooms. So my question is actually, let's also look at beyond classrooms. Because during this pandemic crisis, some students, not only they miss these person-to-person interactions with their peers, their teachers, but they also talk about the campus they missed. And what do you think is the role of campus for learning in the future? And we have seen projects that's undergone by people in Silicon Valley, Minora schools, which is an experimentation of higher education model where there is no physical campus. Students are travel around the world and they learn from the world that they stay and lived in, right? So what do you think the institution will play in such a future, I guess, world where how will the institution still require physical space to provide quality education in the future? And I think this question is for both Professor Prateek and for Professor Maya. Let's just get the conversation going.
Okay, sure. Would you like to go first, Professor
Yes,
Maya,
please. Professor Prateek, yes.
Okay, I'll go first. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. And So I think campuses are still going to be extremely important, and for the simple reason that, education on campuses doesn't just happen within the classroom. There's a lot of education that happens outside of it, and that part, it's very difficult to do on digital media. At least, I mean, and of course, like I said, we are heading into unknown worlds, so it's very hard to say what will happen in the future. But as of now, I don't see campuses kind of becoming kind of just disappearing. However, I think it's important for us to start asking, especially as universities, and what is it that we can provide to our students that an online course cannot? As a physical campus, what is it that we can provide? And this actually requires us to look very deeply at what is it that a classroom as a physical space where learners and teachers come together, what is the value of that space and how are we utilizing that value? I think the lecture is a waste of that space, really. I mean, it's complete waste. You can just put that online and students can watch it. But for example, if we use this flipped classroom kind of idea, where when students come into the classroom, make them do much more interesting activities, physical collaboration. So just to take an example from my from that school I was talking about, one of the physics teachers, right? I mean, they sent the students the lecture on these ray diagrams for the lenses. You have these ray diagrams of lenses where there are 6 different types of ray diagrams where depending on where the object is, the focus is in different areas. So there are 6 of them, right? So they sent them a lecture on these 6, which are typical textbook material. And then what they did when the students came to class was they broke them up into groups. The teacher broke them up into groups and asked them to find the 7th ray diagram. Okay. So there was this nice little competition going on. The students spent 3 classes doing this, which the 3 classes would have otherwise gone into teaching them those 6 ray diagrams. And of course, there is no 7th ray diagram. But in looking for it, the teachers understood those 6 ray diagrams beautifully, I mean, conceptually. So that is, I think, the power of the physical classroom and the campus that, I mean, and of course the campus outside the classroom also, like I said, but that's not my kind of area, that I think we need to keep in mind. So I'm not really in favor of a pure digital learning model at all in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Maya, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Prateek, thank you. It was such a rewarding, session. And I think we're all now more aware, right, of just even the cognitive and the neuroscience sort of behind what digital can mean. And you're completely correct to say that we are evolving, we are testing out these waters. But if there's one thing we know, right, as human beings in societies, we learn so much from each other. So the power of peer learning and the power of that community is what we have come to associate with campuses. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I think we are aware that we are witnessing a generation that has a very active online life, right? In the sense they have 2 lives and their digital lives are equally real. So people often break up online or, do things that we would never even imagine as being polite, right? In terms of how they behave digitally. So I definitely think that we are witnessing a process of becoming. We're not there yet, but our peer networks will enable a certain kind of becoming, right? Which in isolation, I can't even imagine what that looks like. It feels lonely even digitally, right? To be outside of a learning community. So I think that what you said was amazing. Thank you.
Great. So we actually also have a group of very enthusiastic audience, and we get a couple questions from the audience via email before our session even began. So one of these actually related to what Professor Prateek was talking about, and one of the direction he actually pointed us to is smartphone is a powerful device, right? Everybody has smartphone, it's easy to operate, you can get it pretty cheaply. So the question from one of our audience today is, now that this is what a lot of people believe, that smartphone actually led to a breakdown of attention span. And for students, right, in college who grew up with all these devices around them, we notice, and I think we all observe that in our own classroom, is their attention span is so short that how do we actually create a kind of experience that we can actually still help them learn in the way that we want to, and especially during this lockdown. What's your advice to especially all the professors, educators, teachers out there? How should we make the best use of I guess the phone or the tool that we have today?
Yeah, that's a great question actually, and I think there are kind of multiple levels of answers that I'm already thinking of, and I just want to try and arrange that in a way. So firstly, kind of a long-term answer, okay? And I want to go back to that orality and literacy book from Ong that I was talking about. when writing first came in, right, Plato was actually very worried. And a lot of Greek philosophers were actually very worried because they thought this is going to completely kill our memory. And we are just going to be these people who can't remember anything because, you know, now the writing remembers everything for us. But strangely enough, firstly, it's that writing that enables us today to access Plato's ideas still. Secondly, as I mentioned, it's that writing that enabled us to invent mathematics and all these things. So even though it changed our ability to remember, it changed us fundamentally as human beings. It made us different. We became something else, like the becoming that Maya was talking about. So with digital media also, I think we are going to become something else. And it's very possible that the current generation actually doesn't understand the future generation in some ways at all because they're so different. But I mean, when we say losing attention, I mean, I don't know, maybe it'll just be like losing memory back then, and, you know, we will just become someone different, and, you know, we'll learn to adapt to that. But I think it's not necessarily like that. I mean, so for one, I think I'm also seeing this new generation of digital natives coming up with their own ways of actually dealing with the evils of digital media. So they are much smarter than actually some of us, because, you know, for us, it came much later. From a younger age, they are aware, or in some sense, of the issues. And they are coming up with, for example, they will install apps on their phones to prevent them from looking at it more than once an hour, for example. So it's not universal, it's very slow. But we have to be aware that, you know, human beings have, you know, as human beings, we have to have a little faith. I mean, we do find answers to the problems we face. And whatever we don't find to will just change us, and we will become different. And, you know, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe we just think it's bad because it's different from us. But maybe, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. For senior educators, it's very, very difficult to say. I mean, I think there is going to be a clash of generations. This happened even when writing was invented. I think there's no doubt that it's going to happen now that digital media is invented. My only kind of advice is that, you know, really think about, learn from your students maybe. I mean, that's pretty much the only thing you can maybe do. Learn from your students, figure out how they like to learn, and maybe keep an open mind that just because it's different, it's not necessarily a bad way to learn. I mean, you know.
In fact, there's a question actually, Jasmine, by Parth, which says, post-pandemic, how will the educational scenario affect the play atmosphere in learning?
Yeah.
Right? So it's a flip question in a sense, because everyone's talking about the quality of education and he's talking about the quality of play. And I think Prateek would be, you know, the person to say this actually, but it seems like a lot of what we talk about in terms of future pedagogy will be based on gaming, right? The idea that you're actually having fun, and the idea that you're navigating something as a curious, adventurous, right, active agent. So I don't know how the quality of play will change, but I hope the quality of learning will definitely.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as someone who enjoys playing video games, I mean, really, I have this big. I don't say this to people because I feel like they'll judge me. But I really, you know, I really feel like, no, I really do feel like digital games or game-like environments. I won't say games as they are in their current, but game-like environments could really transform the way we learn. And I just want to give an example actually of this game, you know, of these games where there are these grand simulations of, for example, World War II or Europe in the colonial age. And I've played some of them, and it's the first time when I played those games that I actually began to understand the depth of the, you know, small subtle factors that, of course, it's a simulation, it's simplification, but even within that simplified model, it gave me much more details than a history textbook, which basically tells you these are the 5 causes of World War II. You know, so I mean, I think there is a whole new way to learn through games. But we have to be careful because people have also found that the entertainment factors of games can sometimes distract from the learning factor. And so we need to find ways to align both of them.
Yeah.
There is a whole design process of that. But yes, I have big hope from that.
So I think these conversations just brought me to the next question that also, you know, a few of us have wanted to ask for quite some time, and I'm going to like ask it promptly because I know we have some educators here, but please, you know, bear with me with such a blunt question. So, you know, like you guys talk about games, and there are many online games that are actually not just for entertainment only, actually designed to help you learn. Like for example, there's a language app called Duolingo, which helps you learn different languages in a game-like environment. There's a website called vocabulary.com that helps you acquire vocabularies, right, at a much faster speed, and through competition within your own classes, within your own school district. Like all of these are out there currently, and I think people can easily access them with a very little cost. or maybe free. In some cases, they are free. So if we look at this, some of this design, there isn't any physical human interaction that need to happen. I mean, if it is, then it was actually in the process of designing the environment. It wasn't a professor or a faculty member there to direct them how they play the game. It kind of made it in a way that you can self-learn and you can navigate among this platform pretty easily. So with these changes in like artificial intelligence, machine learning, these platforms can actually extract user behaviors, and they can understand how students learn, and they can even advance the game in order to make the learning more effective. Right. So now, what is the role of faculty members or teachers if such environment can exist outside of classes and can become a pretty immersive learning experience for learners? And maybe even make it more personalized, right? Student-centered. So I'm just curious about what do you both think?
Should I go first again, or
yeah,
would you like to? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've kind of gotten very interested in machine learning over the past few months, partly because it's very important for what we consider learning also. It's really changing that notion. But I mean, from an education perspective, I mean, maybe there's a point where artificial intelligence just takes over all our jobs, you know. That world is possible. Like I said, we're going to unknown worlds. We don't know. But I think there are a couple of things here. And okay, let's see. Firstly, from a kind of a games perspective, right? There are two types of ways in which gaming is being used for learning. One way is in which you just take what is called these the incentive part of games, which is like the rewards, the labels, the point systems, and you just put them onto a learning app, and you know you reward people for learning, and you call it a game. To me, that's a very poor idea of using games for learning, you know, which is what a lot of these actually apps today do. You know, and I don't believe in that as, you know, games. I do believe in games that actually open up learning as an exploration. So you know, games as exploratory kind of worlds which you can go through, you can create your own path. And if you can create, and you know, and yes, what you know, neural networks and all can help us do is actually kind of moderate those paths so that, you know, they are still kind of help us focus that learning. But I think that's a long way away. And until that happens, I think the faculty will have a very important role in two areas. One is in moderating and curating this learning path for the learner. And this is where the faculty-student relationship will become very important, because the faculty can develop this deep understanding of each student and, you know, personalize and curate that learning path for each of them. But they also have this sense of, when do I bring students together and ask them to learn with each other and not just playing this game on their own, you know, that kind of thing. The second is, I think, because machines learn in a very different way from humans do, from the way that humans do. And so faculty will always have a role in helping students learn how to learn. This is really, really important. I think it's taken me a PhD to eventually have some understanding of how to learn, you know. You know, generally we are very poor at this. I mean, we can be very bright. I was very smart academically, but learning how to learn is a very different, it's a wisdom thing. It's not an intelligence thing. And our faculty can really help our students kind of, you know, do that. So how do you go through all this content, and how do you make sure you're learning from it in a way that's, you know, informed by wisdom? And that I think faculty still has to do.
Yeah. Prateek, to sort of just add to that, you know, I was thinking in China, there's that AI squirrel, and, you know, in terms of adaptive pedagogy, adaptive learning, there is a lot of technology that's sort of come to the fore, right, with these, you know, things. But in terms of mentoring, right, and somebody made a really lovely comment, I think Jayashree Bhattacharya in the chat, where she said the concept of 3 hours have changed to 4 hours, right?
Right.
Reasonability, rewards, and relationship. And that humanity of the relationship that I think mentor and, you know, coach, right? I think the professor is in some sense the coach as well as the facilitator, right? As you said, in the learning to learn process. But really it is the humanity of those relationships that will always endure. The idea of the sage on the stage has now at least given way to a much more sort of relationship-based learning. So in many ways, you know, I think the colleges remain relevant for that very reason. Yeah. Jasmine, you want to take some questions from the Q&A?
Yeah. Sure. So there are quite a few questions, and I see, wow, yeah, we do have a lot of questions coming our way. There is, I mean, this is related to smartphone again, and I think that maybe, you know, let's see if we can try to address this. There is a question about, do you feel the education-centric smartphones can incorporate augmented reality will help boost the concept of digital education? And how long do you think it will take the Indian education system to properly integrate this type of technology? Prateek?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So I think as far as augmented reality goes, I think that's more feasible. It doesn't usually require a lot of hardware. Mostly with current smartphones, you can use AR apps. VR is slightly more hardware intensive, and I don't see that becoming commonplace in Indian education anytime soon right now. I think it's very expensive. Also, the users of VR, because mostly it's, we call it a virtual reality, but it's actually only the visual part of it that is virtualized. The other parts of the environment, we have still not figured out effective ways to virtualize, like, you know, the sounds, sounds maybe, but smell, motion, you know, those kind of things. I mean, so virtual reality, I think, is still a distant thing. Augmented reality, I think, yes, I think it can definitely play a role, especially like, for example, in localizing education. So, you know, like I said, you in my smartphone app, you could simultaneously have that cube and the equation together. Let's say you are teaching, you know, a science course, you know, or an environmental science course, and the person is walking around the environment using that smartphone. And the phone can actually, with machine learning especially, can actually be intelligent enough to point out learning opportunities in that environment using scientific, you know, concepts and all of that. And so that, I feel, could be really, really useful in actually localizing education. And you don't even need a smartphone for every student. Just a teacher could walk around with a smartphone. And there could be things, I mean, like I said, unknown worlds, I really don't have all the answers. I'm just speculating here. But I think, yeah, I think that could be very useful, definitely.
Yeah, Prateek, that is linked to a question I think Peter Lowenstein asks, which is, how will we evaluate if online learning can offer an adequate or excellent education, right? Adequacy and excellence are two different measures, but what is the yardstick really for measurement in this environment?
I go back to, can wood make good houses? Can wood make good houses? I think right now it's too early to do any of this thing. Firstly, because we don't know what learning with digital media will actually look like. Imagine, for example, before the invention of writing, right? I go to this caveman and ask them, you know, look, writing has just been invented. How do you think you will evaluate learning, people who learn with writing, whether they're learning effectively or not? What do you think that person will say? Right. So, I mean, we are really at that stage where I think we don't know what learning will be like. We don't know what knowledge will look like. Right. We really don't want to talk about effectiveness of learning. What we want to think about is, how is it that we can rethink learning with digital media in ways that are effective, rather than asking, you know, separating media from learning and asking, how can will digital media make learning more effective? So rather, it's how can we reassemble learning in a way with digital media that is effective? You know, I think that is the better question to ask.
Right.
And I think because we are about to run out of time, but I like to actually also, you know, address a couple of questions that actually get asked by a few audience here. And this is especially related to the context we are in, right? Because here we are in India, and people are aware of this digital divide. You know, not every student or even teacher have access to digital tools to, you know, to help students learn. So maybe can we hear from Professor Prateek or maybe Professor Maya, like in terms of this, for Indian educators, what would be something that they can start to incorporate, or maybe what should they be prepared for when it comes to a situation where they just know that, you know, they don't have the access to internet or to the smartphone that we discussed?
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, accusation almost, right, of digital divide presumes that there were other forms of equity that already existed, right? And it's really irritating because there's a sense in which who said that the extent education itself was so phenomenal and that teachers were so awesome in the classroom, and that even classrooms had capacity in terms of infrastructure and basics. right? Of course, this is viewed as, in suspicious terms, right, as some kind of capitalist takeover where, you know, you're just trying to, you know, push the technology. And as Prateek has been saying throughout this session, right, you're talking about the learning, not the tech. The tech is just the means. So if we want to get to the learning, the question is, how do we build capacity? Totally agree, we're not there yet. But there is a moment right now where rural India is exceeding urban India in terms of capacity, in terms of connectivity, access to smartphones, right? The dependence of agriculture on smartphones. These things have happened in the past 5 years. In fact, the overtake of rural is to urban just happened. So right there has to be a much smarter way of forecasting and saying that we are not there yet, but we are moving there. And maybe the quality of learning for our most disadvantaged can be improved. Right, precisely by building capacity. So I think that I really appreciate where one of the first questions, in fact, in our chat was about the digital divide, right? And I think this is the one thing that is always used to kind of stymie the efforts of where digital learning can go. But the truth is that they're actually separate. You know, the quality of learning is a separate issue, and the quality of access to technology is a separate issue.
Yeah.
How do we sort of think of them, you know, in terms of enhancing both capacity? So, yeah, Prateek.
Yeah, and just to add some that, because I was actually consulting not too long ago last year with Sterlite Technologies, who is actually working with the government on the BharatNet project, which is a project to lay fiber optic cables to every Gram Panchayat. And many states have actually started taking this up. In Maharashtra especially, I think there's a lot of work already being done on this, and other states also, I think. And I think see, the point is, if we are ready to accept that smartphones can be a very a universal learning tool, then the government, I think, is intelligent enough to find ways to make sure that that access is, provided. And like Maya said, we are really romanticizing this textual system that we have currently. Is literacy not a huge divide today between, you know, people who can learn and people who can't? People who have access to the education and knowledge that we have today and people who don't. A smartphone, on the other hand, is so much more accessible, and with natural language processing, with machine learning, it can actually talk to you. You don't even need to type anymore. You don't need to do anything. You can just talk to your phone in your local language. And Google's, I think, what is that project called? Is
the next billion? The next
the Maya or something project where they actually not Maya, it's something
translate.
Yeah, where they're collecting actually vernacular languages and actually training the Android system to work very well with them.
Right.
So yeah, I think we need to stop romanticizing what we have currently.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of discussions that we look forward continue to have, right? Because I feel that the more discussion we have, the more we can see how the mental barriers that we have inside of us to prevent us from seeing the opportunities that's lying right in front of us. Before we end, I just want to ask this one last question. And it's a very short question, but I think it's also very important. This is from Peter Lorenstein. He's asking about how can we best incentivize innovation in education? And I think this is something that we also experience ourselves, where, you know, education seems to be a closed loop ecosystem where when something changes outside the technical innovation happen in the industry, it doesn't get translated, it isn't absorbed quickly enough in the education system. So what are your views on that? Professor Prateek?
I'll actually, so to be honest, I personally don't think our education technology industry has been doing a very great job of innovating. If you look at the biggest company that is out there today, Baidu's, I mean, what they've taken is technology that is pretty much 20 years old right now, and they've just popularized it, I think. I've seen some of the lectures, and no offense, I mean, I'm sure they are working to improve all the time, and I looked at them maybe 5-6 years ago, and maybe they've bettered themselves. And I know they're constantly trying to do R&D. But a lot of the features of digital media that I was mentioning, you know, the new features that are already available, are not being used very widely in these innovations. Firstly, I don't think many great innovations are happening. Secondly, what I said, like even within my PhD thesis, even when I tried to use a very innovative app, we kept getting dragged back to the textual educational assemblage, because eventually the teacher has to come back to, this is what you will write in the examination. So we can't think of the learning portion of the education as a separate thing where we can just introduce all this technology while the other parts are where they are, especially our examination and certification system. So until we actually find ways to rethink what it means to learn, we examine our notions of what it means to be a learned person, how to examine and certify learning. I don't think it's a matter of, I don't know who we are blaming really. I mean, it's who's stopping this? Schools are interested, companies are interested, students are interested, parents are interested.
I think, can you answer to Manish's question, which is names of a few good apps for learning? I mean, I know exactly what you're saying. Byju's just took the tuition model and moved it, to another format. But in terms of somebody in the education space that you think is actually doing, pioneering, innovative, effective, work.
Yeah, this is actually very difficult to keep up with because people are coming up with new things all the time.
Right.
And I can't say I have completed. I will give you some. So, for example, for a 4th grade student, I think for algebra, there's this very nice app called Dragon Box, I think. Which what you do is instead of like these variables like x and y, which students have a lot of trouble understanding, they actually have dragons of different colors. And you move them around, but you can only move them around using the laws of algebra, and the app will actually tell you that this is an invalid move. So students find this a little more engaging, and they're actually learning the laws of algebra without explicitly being told the rules or having to understand what a variable is. And of course, the problem is that this doesn't guarantee that they will learn algebra, in the sense that it doesn't guarantee that it will translate to the textual version of algebra that they have to do in their schools.
Right.
So that is where the teacher has to actually come in and say, okay, help them make that transition or that translation. But I've spoken to a teacher who has used it in their class, and they have found it slightly easier to explain algebra.
Yeah, these are definitely early days, right?
Yeah. So I think we are 10 past 6. I just feel that, we can go on and on, right? This will never end. But maybe what we will do is, I think from our side at Flame, we are definitely committed to, having these conversations when it comes to digital learning. And we have Professor Maya here, who is in charge of the Center of Teaching and Learning. We have Professor Prateek Shah here, who is also dedicated to doing more research and sharing with us his research in this domain. So we will try to actually share with everybody who participated today some resources or some information that we feel that maybe you will find interesting and beneficial. And then we also encourage you guys to come back to write to us. We'll share the emails with you guys on the email that you will receive. Share with us your questions, and we can continue our discussions in a different forum altogether. But before we go, anything that you would like to share, Professor Prateek, with the audience, and Professor Maya too? Maybe start with Professor Prateek.
No, thank you so much for attending. I hope it was worth your time. And like I said, please feel free to email me further questions at that email address. And I think Jasmine, should we just show them the next webinar announcement?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so we have an upcoming webinar, and Jasmine, would you like to talk about it? Or?
Oh, sure. So, before I go, I just want to let Professor Maya also say a few words before we end the session.
Yeah. No, I think we're grappling with, just like everybody else in the country is right now, right, in terms of education, with a lot of these questions. And we hope to compile and collate some of the best practices and resources at the Center for Teaching and Learning webpage. So please watch this space, log into our website, and I'm sure we'll have more to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And as you can see, this ConneXions series webinar is really trying to engage all of us into conversations that we can openly discuss and also exchange ideas. So our next topic for ConneXions series is actually addressing isolation and social distancing in times of coronavirus. And we have Professor Shah from psychology department joining with Professor Nina, also from psychology department, to continue our conversations with all of you. And I know there are a couple of audience, a few people today also asked about in terms of the technology and mental relationship between technology and mental health. So maybe this will be another session that we can all join together and continue our conversations. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will, talk to you soon on another platform. Thank you. Take care, guys.